Hey, it's Drybear. Earlier in the week, I looked at the overall distribution of classes and ascendancies in Path of Exile 2 in the top 1000 for the launch of early access. But it's been nearly a week since I pulled those stats, and a lot of people on the video mentioned that they would like to see a weighted amount of deaths on the hardcore characters to see of the amount of Infernalists that are in hardcore, how many of them are still alive. So we're gonna look at the updated stats, what's changed in the basically all throughout the weekend and at the end of the week, and the weighted distribution of deaths. So as a point of reference, this is what we saw. I think I pulled these numbers about Monday or Tuesday, so it's been about 5 days since we saw these numbers here. So this is what we saw last week, like coming out of last weekend. And this is where we're at through the end of this weekend in the standard setup. So standard league, you can trade all of that. I think this kind of goes to show how many people were actually playing Stormweaver and using it, and why they ended up nerfing it in the first place. The distribution of Stormweaver only went up throughout the week, even before the hotfix, and after the hotfix, at least in standard league, hasn't changed much. It seems a lot of people, even after the nerf to cast on freeze and some of the trigger effects as well, are still sticking with their Stormweaver and playing it. So Infernalists in the standard league kind of stayed popular, but Stormweaver, either through some, must have been a creator or content creator builds going out, or just word of mouth on general forums, everyone started playing their Stormweaver and pushing it all the way to the end of the top 1000. So all the hardcore, pushing, sweating people were playing Stormweaver, and that just jumped up and exploded over the last 5 days or so. But you can see that a lot of the other builds, like Acolyte of Chayula, Chronomancer, Gemling Legionnaire, still remain at the very bottom. Pathfinder seems to be actually up a little bit. I know there's some people that are playing a Poison Pathfinder and finding great success with it, although we do see a notable drop over the last 5 days in Titan and Warbringer. Actually, in the opening weekend, many people, like when the game came out last Friday, a lot of people had made Warrior. We saw a very high percentage of Warrior players in the top 1000, and over the last 5 days or so, the Warrior percentage has gone down significantly. Either they just decided that between levels 60 and 80, they got to the point where they just didn't want to play their Warrior anymore, or they just re-rolled to something else. A lot of those players that were playing Warrior obviously re-rolled to Stormweaver just over the last week. We're still seeing Blood Mage down, and actually I'm kind of shocked to see how low Mercenary has gone considering where we started at the opening weekend. A lot of people were playing Mercenary as well, and I think Mercenary is definitely one of the top 3. They are very powerful. Witch Hunters specifically are very strong, but at least in the trading standard league, in standard, Mercenary seems to be dropping in popularity as well in favor of Deadeye Ranger, Infernalist, and Stormweaver on the Witch and the Sorceress respectively. But moving on to the solo self-found standard league, you can see that outside of the trading league, if you look at just standard solo self-found, if you're new to Path of Exile, this means if you activate a solo self-found flag on your character when you create it, it means you can't really interact with other players. You can't really do any party content or clear things in a party, and you can't trade with other players either. So you have to do everything solo, and you have to find or craft all the gear that you get. But you can see that outside of the trading league, in the solo self-found standard league, it's a lot more evenly distributed. Stormweaver much lower on this, and then that might be just where people are, as they realize in the trading league they can boost up a Stormweaver with the new hot build that everyone's talking about, buy all the items from trade that they need to make it work, and then test it out and push to the top. And in fact, a lot of the people on the top league for the standard league are Stormweavers. Like, Stormweavers just blew past everyone in the clear speed and amount of XP that they were getting. But in solo self-found, it's a lot more evenly distributed, at least from the mid line up. You can see Infernalist takes the top spot in solo self-found standard, Deadeye in second place, and then Invoker actually quite high. So Invoker Monks in solo self-found doing excellently. And we're not seeing the drop in Warriors here. In fact, the distribution of Warriors in solo self-found is much higher than it was for the standard league earlier in the week. Stormweaver there towards the middle, and then Witch Hunter Warbringer there as well. And what's interesting is there are actually quite a lot of Gemling Legionnaire mercenaries in solo self-found standard that are just rocking it and killing it, which I think is really cool and exciting. Chronomancer is actually the lowest for solo self-found standard, Acolyte of Chayula a little bit higher, and Pathfinder much lower, with Blood Mage being up there as well. And I would imagine that the people that are playing solo self-found standard, they're probably just cruising, living their life. They can die if they want to, but it's all solo. They're just doing the best they can to make the class or ascendancy that they chose that they thought was cool in the opening weekend, and they're just kind of cruising. They don't really care what other people think. Now, things get kind of squirrely when we look at hardcore relative to standard. So this is hardcore, not solo cell phone. So trading hardcore option here. You can see that Stormweaver is way down. And again, the more I look at this, the more I believe that people just, Stormweaver was flavor of the month. If you're playing standard trade open league with Stormweaver, everyone just saw the new Stormweaver builds that were cast on X and just bought all the gear they needed to make it work, and then just started grinding it out. And so that's why we saw the explosion. But in hardcore specifically, Infernalists are the highest. They were the highest coming out of last weekend as well. Very popular, very strong, and very durable as well. So we're seeing a good amount of them be like controlling the top 1,000 for hardcore. Then Deadeye and Titan there as well, and then Invoker, which you're kind of seeing like the hardcore class distribution actually kind of mirrors the solo cell-found distribution on standard as well. We're seeing Pathfinder at the very bottom of representation for hardcore. Maybe they're just leveling the slowest. Acolyte of Cholula coming up a bit, Chronomancer coming up a bit, but Blood Mage coming down in hardcore overall in the distribution. So then maybe that, I mean, a lot of people are theorizing that Blood Mage is just because they use their HP too much, that it causes them to be a lot more risky in hardcore and require them to build tankier with more HP recovery, leech, regeneration, that sort of thing. But looking at this here, you can see that the distribution is a lot more similar to what it was before that big explosion, because hardcore is a little bit harder to change. You still need to have enough survivability regardless of your build to survive what's going on. Interestingly enough, if you look at the hardcore solo cell-found audience, it's pretty close together. This is probably the most insulary group of people. The hardcore solo cell-found, they just kind of live in their own world and nothing really affects them. However, there's a couple noteworthy things on this as well. You notice that Infernalist is still way up there. Deadeye, Titan, and Invoker still in the top 4 as well for hardcore distribution on the solo cell-found moniker. But what's interesting here is you'll see that Gemling Legionnaire for hardcore solo cell-found shot up a whole bunch, which means that people that are leveling fast enough to be in the top 1,000 through this weekend are doing it well with Gemling Legionnaire. Witch Hunter a little bit lower, but I'm excited to see Gemling getting some love here for solo cell-found hardcore. People will be pushing that. You can see that Blood Mage is up as well, and Stormweaver is way down. So solo cell-found hardcore, it seems like a lot of people are relying on being able to trade or buy for their items that they need to make Stormweaver builds work. But if you have to find the items yourself, and or you have to worry about only having one life permanently, Stormweaver drops pretty dramatically. Warbringer and Titan still up there pretty good as well. Chronomancer towards the bottom, and then of course Pathfinder, Acolyte of Cholula still at the bottom of popularity or representation in the top 1,000 players in the current play state right now. Next is a statistic that was asked for in my last video. Last video I showed basically the distribution of classes in just normal, standard and hardcore, and we looked at the overall death rates, which actually as a number wasn't all that interesting. And what people were asking for in the comments was, can you do a weighted per class death rate, which means of the amount of that class that are in the hardcore category, what percentage of them have died versus lived. So that's what you're looking at here. So at the very bottom, Infernalists die the least, which means that only 35.14% of the Infernalists in the top 1,000 for hardcore league are dead. The remaining percentage are still alive. So as far as like the amount of deaths, like how much of them die relative to how many there are, Infernalist and Witch Hunter are by far the strongest survivors in hardcore as of this weekend for the top 1,000. Then it goes Warbringer, Acolyte of Cholula. Blood Mage is not the highest death rate, surprisingly. Of all the Blood Mages that are in the hardcore category, only 41% of them have died, whereas, relative to like Stormweaver, half of the Stormweavers in hardcore are dead. Like half of them died, half of them are still alive. Deadeye still up there as well. Gemling Legionnaire. And again, this is weighted by how many there are. This is not, based on like if there's a lot of Stormweavers, there's going to be a lot of deaths. This is weighted against itself, meaning that of the Stormweavers that are there, what percentage, like what is the percentage chance that a Stormweaver is dead if they're in the top 1,000? A distribution there. And it's not actually as even as you would think. You would think that this would be, pretty close together, a very smooth curve. on the distribution here, but you can see that some of the classes are actually just on average better at surviving than others, and could be just because Witch Hunter has great survivability with the sorcery ward, which allows them to absorb magical damage consistently. Infernalists can stand behind their minions and survive that way. Warbringer has great armor, or they can also do like Encased in Jade to avoid damage as well, so that might be leading a little bit more to their survival rate. Another interesting statistic is to look at the archetype. So this is for normal hardcore deaths per archetype, whether they're ranged or melee. A huge asterisk on this one. I am just placing the classes in their intended roles, meaning like Invoker is melee. Now there's going to be some Ascendancies, and because of the system set up in Path of Exile 2, you could run a ranged warrior, you could also run a melee sorceress, right? So this isn't gonna be perfectly accurate. This is just taking the Ascendancies and classes at face value, assuming that all warriors are melee, assuming that all witches are ranged, right? Or they stand behind their minions, but it's not gonna be accurate. It's just kind of like a fun statistic to look at. And you can see that throughout the hardcore top 1000, slightly more melee deaths than ranged if you just use that simplification, simplification over what we're looking at, right? So if this is to be believed, you can see that melee dies slightly more than ranged, but there is definitely a belief right now that melee are way worse off than ranged, and even if you just kind of take it this like 1,000-foot view, you do see a slight bump in deaths for melee on the hardcore category. Next, we can look at solo self-found hardcore death rates. Again, this is weighted against itself, which means that this is of the classes, the class itself weighted against itself, not with other classes and the distribution. So this is just the death rate of that ascendancy in the top 1,000 for solo self-found hardcore death rates. And you can see that at the very top, at a standard deviation away from the rest, is Stormweavers. So 66% of the Stormweavers that made it onto the top 1,000 leaderboards for Stormweaver in solo self-found hardcore are dead. A third of the Stormweavers are left. Invoker, very high death rate. Chronomancer, Warbringer, Witch Hunter, very high death rate. About half the Titan, Deatheye, and Pathfinder players are dead. But then below that are some very high survivors. You can even see that even in solo self-found hardcore, Infernalist is still crazy high survival rate. Gemling, Legionnaire, and Blood Mage for solo self-found quite good. But a weird standout, and this could just be because there aren't as many Acolytes of Chayula, but of the Acolytes of Chayula that made it into the solo self-found hardcore top 1,000, only a third of them are dead. So, 2/3 of them are still alive and kicking on the leaderboard, which is pretty interesting. So a little bit different than that. It does mirror a little bit of the hardcore death rates per class weighted that we saw for the regular category, just a little bit more skewed on solo self-found where you can't buy your gear from the trade site. Next is the death rates by archetype. Again, asterisk, this is just putting them in their category, and apologies, this red is blinding, kind of blinding flashbang here, but you can see that the death rates on average are higher in solo self-found, which makes sense. We remember this was like 40% and 43% on hardcore trade, which means that you can buy more defenses, you can buy better gear. Trade generally results in better gear and better builds because you have access to everyone's drops. But solo self-found, you can say that the hardcore death rates in solo self-found are noticeably higher, that people tend to die a lot more consistently in solo self-found hardcore than just regular hardcore. And then you can see that there's actually a bigger disparity here as well. 48%, 49% of ranged deaths, and then over half of the melee in the solo self-found hardcore death rates, around 53%, have died already. They made it onto the leaderboard, but then they perished for one reason or another. But those are the latest stats for the week. I pulled the data just about an hour ago, so it's very current on the leaderboards now based on who's playing and what's working on. And let me know if you'd like me to continue this series every, once a week or something like that, just to check in and see what's changing. At a certain point, there will be a diminishing return because everyone's going to hit level 100 on the leaderboards and it will become less interesting. But at least now for early access, when we just got our refresh start character and people are trying new things, it might be interesting to keep track of this stuff. So let me know in the comments down below. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people. And don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.